Israel has a new prime minister as Benjamin Netanyahu's rival, Naftali Bennett, won a parliamentary vote to form a new government, ousting the Israeli politician. During his inaugural speech, the new prime minister designate was heckled by parliament members who voted against the transition.
I am proud of sitting together with people who have very different opinions. Nice.
Democracy can be messy, right? Sure. Netanyahu gave his own address to the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament, and sent a clear message: he will not be silenced.
For my friends here in the Knesset and to the millions of citizens in Israel, I tell you today, do not be downhearted. Stand tall. We shall continue to work together for our beloved country. I am with you for a daily battle against this bad, dangerous left-wing government to topple it. And with God's help, it will happen much sooner than...
President Biden called Bennett to congratulate him and say the United States looks forward to working together with him. While the U.S. had a strong ally in the Bibi Netanyahu for the last 12 years, Bennett is not a new face here. His political career until now was actually working for Netanyahu.
Journalist Zaid Jilani joins us now to discuss the election and how it's going to impact the United States, our relationship with them, and the Middle East at large. Zaid,
how you doing? It's great to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Yes, good to be here.
So I have a question, and it's because I spend so much time doing political campaigns. How did they put this together that there was this coalition government of all these parties with seemingly, divergent interests to oust Netanyahu? Was just a case of like an enemy of an enemy is my friend?
Yeah, I think so. And you also have to remember, Israel uses a parliamentary system and a proportional voting system, meaning that they had, I think, around 5 elections in a row where they weren't actually able to get together a coalition to form a stable government, right? So I think partly this was a result of frustration. They had been trying to remove Netanyahu, trying to remove the Likud party, the ruling Likud party, for a number of years now through successive elections. And I think they finally realized that there was only really one way to do it, and only one way really to establish power. And if you look at the vote in the Knesset, Netanyahu was only displaced by 1 vote, right?
Yeah.
I think that speech that he was giving there maybe could end up being prescient. This may not be the most stable coalition in the world. It may not be a government that lasts very long, but it is one that was just enough to topple him and to bring in, as Bennett was suggesting himself, kind of a coalition of odd bedfellows, some of whom are quite to the left of him, and some of whom I think are mostly there for opportunistic reasons.
Well, I can't even remember a time pre-Bibi. I mean, he spoke to our Congress. He's here all the time. We know him so well. How do you think this will impact? Biden called him last night the new prime minister, but how do you think this is going to impact our relationship?
Well, I don't think it'll change too much with the U.S.-Israel relationship, because the U.S.-Israel relationship is based on more than just personalities or one political party, the Likud party in Israel. I think the fundamental interest will stay the same. The fundamental politics in the United States will stay the same. I am curious whether Naftali Bennett sort of moderates some of his lines and some of the positions he takes. He tends to be on the even more right-wing side of the Israeli spectrum than Netanyahu. And one thing he said in the past is that he doesn't necessarily even think Israel should take U.S. military aid, which is an unusual position for an Israeli prime minister. Generally, that's one of their top priorities, to secure that aid. But he's in a coalition with other parties, I think, who want to have a closer relationship with the United States. So that would be something I would expect him not to stress very much. And honestly, I don't expect the relationship with the U.S. to change very much. I think domestically within Israel, they have certain domestic priorities, particularly on their economy, on issues like social rights and civil marriage and the role of religion in Israel, where they do expect to see some changes.
So I'm really interested in talking about how they work this out and how, even though they use a proportional representation system, it might relate to how we can view, the hope for some bipartisanship here. Because there are some, kind of far left elements of this coalition, some far right elements of this coalition, and some centrists. How did they pull this off? How did they put this together? And do you think that the recent, Israeli-Palestinian conflict had anything to do with this kind of coming together at the last minute and 1 vote being issued to oust them?
Yeah, I don't know that the conflict had that much to do with it. I think the conflict was an attempt. Netanyahu did try to rally the people around the flag during the conflict, to kind of make the case that he was the man for the hour. But fundamentally, I don't think that Israelis viewed their their politics the same way we view it, right? Like, I think in the United States or in Europe, we largely view Israel as revolving around the conflict with the Palestinians or the issue with the Palestinians. But within Israel, I think they are very, what's really important to them is domestic issues. And I think a lot of, particularly domestic issues dealing with like the cost of living, the cost of housing, things like that. I don't think the Likud had really done much to secure the support of sort of middle class or below middle class people, really working class people, many of whom I think went to vote for center-left parties or parties like Shas, which is like a religious party, which has somewhat left-leaning economic views and right-leaning social views, which is, the kind of combinations you get in a proportional system, which is an interesting, system, a parliamentary arrangement. So I think that, again, this coalition came together as a coalition of convenience. I think many people had differing frustrations with Likud. I think some of the more left-leaning coalition members like Meretz, of course, had disagreements with Netanyahu over the Palestinians, but I think some of the ones on the right and in the center had disagreements with Likud over domestic issues, over issues like, again, the cost of housing, cost of living, the way that Likud has approached the economy. And I think that coalition of different interests, even though, I don't think the Meretz party and I don't think Naftali Bennett, and I don't think that Mansour Abbas and there's an actual Islamist party now in Israel's government. I don't think that they would agree on 6 or 7 out of 10 issues, but they did agree that there needed to be a new government in Israel. And I think after 12 years, Benjamin Netanyahu had created quite a few enemies, right? And those enemies were able to kind of talk to each other and figure it out. And so I think having that one common purpose of toppling the incumbent government and having disagreements with that government on a range of issues actually is kind of what brought them together. They didn't really necessarily need to have much more agreement other than that.
I was actually just one thing I was follow up on that about Bibi leaving, Netanyahu leaving. Did you hear when he said something to the fact of like, I'm not really going and I'll be back in 6 months? I mean, he's just not walking away. So what do you think is going to happen down the road?
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu is actually, maybe he's comfortable being in the opposition in some ways. We think of him as being in the government because he's been there for so long. He's served 12 years. Before that, he served as well. Mm-hmm. But he was also a major opposition leader in the 1990s. He was someone who I think some people on the Israeli left really were embittered by because of his opposition to Rabin and some of the stuff he was doing with the peace talks. So I think that Netanyahu in many ways sees himself as a natural fit in the opposition. And I think he is actually onto something when he suggests this coalition is not the most stable in the world, right? Because it is really an odd bedfellow coalition. And the thing that brought them together was toppling Likud and Bibi. And so once that's gone, can they stay together? I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think when you have these proportional systems and these coalition governments around the world, that's always a question, right? As to whether they have the interest to keep the government going after they come together once for something. So.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you brought that up, and you brought up some of the reasons behind the change and the domestic issues, because it seems like, look, the domestic issues that fueled this change are the same domestic issues that we're struggling with around the world, and the United States is struggling with at the same time. It's like, how do we deal with an economy where working class people are struggling with all the things that affect their daily lives? And we were talking about in some earlier segments, even here today, the fact that the cost of everything is going up with inflationary pressure, et cetera. So, I mean, I think that both our governments around the world, and probably this new Israeli government and coalition is really going to have to show some results for regular working class folks if they want to maintain this coalition. And if they don't, there's going to be divergent interests that push them apart, and the blame game will start all over again. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that maybe it's a little too reductive to say that every election in the world revolves around the economy, but it does tend to be one of those top 3 issues, unless the country is like involved in a hot war or some other kind of crisis. The reality is that Israel has faced a cost of living crisis for quite some time, and I think that some people on the right kind of ignored this issue. Maybe they had presented the idea that maybe people should go live in the settlements or something. Maybe Naftali Bennett himself is a settler who became prime minister of Israel, and I'm sure he's a fan of that option. But I think a lot of people within Israel, they remember Israel in the 70s and 80s when it was much easier to live there. The cost of living was much lower. The economic safety net was much stronger in Israel then than it is now. And I think that eventually governments around the world do have to address the actual economic needs of people, and when they don't, I think it tends to create resentment. In fact, it's probably a much bigger issue in these successive elections than anything that happened with the Palestinians, I would argue. So,
I'm just struck. I worked at the State Department. You know this. I worked at the State Department, and we went to Gaza and West Bank and tried to negotiate Mideast peace. The end of this, and nothing has changed. I'm just struck by how much the economic problems in the Palestinian territories have not changed. They're still bombing Israel. We still have the Iron Dome, and it's just this intransable problem. And so many people have come and tried, and we've had envoys repeatedly trying to resolve this problem between the Palestinians and Israelis, and it's hard for their government. It's hard for our government.
Yeah, that brings up a great question, Zaid. Do you think that this coalition government will have any more success at kind of rectifying in short term or hopefully the long term the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
My guess is no, because it's an unstable coalition, right? I think in order to actually do that, they would, there's two kind of big tracks for them. One would be the establishment of some kind of Palestinian state in West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The other one would be establishing voting rights for the 5 million Palestinians who don't have any voting rights but who live kind of under Israeli rule. And both those things would require enormous political credibility. And I don't think that a coalition that barely got into power, that's kind of a set of people who don't necessarily agree with each other on many things, can necessarily do that. In fact, I honestly think that it would have been more likely under a more right-leaning government, because it would have seen it as having more credibility among the Israeli public to make those kind of concessions. So, yeah, I honestly, I don't see that happening under this government. It seems like more of a longer-term thing, which is maybe a little bit of a trope to say with this conflict, but...
That's right, Zed. Everything in the Middle East is always a longer-term thing, and I don't think we'll ever get there, right? End of time, I suppose. So thank you so much for being here. Really great analysis. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Zaid.
Thank you.
Coming up on Rising, Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal joins us next.